We're going to focus right now on workplace discrimination and in regards to race and gender. There are other discriminations going on, but this is what we're going to focus on in our interview today. And what I would like for you to first answer is, how do people make their way to you? How do they determine that they have been discriminated against, or like what is happening? Give me an example or go more in depth in what is happening in that situation.
Oftentimes a person will feel that something is off at work. And usually we say if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And that's true of employment discrimination. If you feel like you're being treated differently from your coworkers, if you notice that you're not receiving the same level of favoritism, you're constantly being denied promotions for which you're equally or better qualified than the folks who actually get them, something might not be right there. And what we look at is your membership in a protected class or category. So the question we ask is typically, do you believe that the adverse action that you're suffering in the workplace is related to your membership in a protected class or category, meaning race, sex, or gender, or pregnancy, disability, age, religion, national origin? There's also another area of the law that the state of Missouri has now put into a statute. You could call it something similar to whistleblower protection. We used to call it the public policy exception to the at-will employment doctrine. And so there are several different types of claims that you can maintain for that. So for instance, if you spoke out against unlawful conduct or conduct that violates public policy, if you refuse to engage in conduct that violates public policy, or if you made a third party or outside report about unlawful conduct or conduct that violates public policy, you might also have a claim. And so we look for a couple different areas. There is discrimination, harassment, a hostile work environment, and retaliation. And all of these claims tend to fall under either Title VII, which is a federal protection, and usually people will refer or commonly understand what the EEOC is, and the EEOC will investigate or enforce Title VII claims. And then we look at the Missouri Human Rights Act, which is the state of Missouri's equivalent to Title VII.
All right, let's break that down, that answer down, that very thorough answer. Tell me more about protected classes. What is the origin of that? When you say protected classes, give me a little primer on what is a protected class, and please.
So under Title VII or the Missouri Human Rights Act, the typical protected classes or categories that I mentioned would be race, sex, disability, age, national origin. Pregnancy discrimination is often a creature of sex or gender discrimination. And unfortunately, not all states, including the state of Missouri, include protections for sexual orientation or gender identity as well. And the origin of the idea that we have these protected classes or categories, these are folks that have, in the employment context or in public housing, or in other types of places of public accommodation, have historically been left out or historically been discriminated against. And the legislature has decided that these folks deserve special protections because of the history of wrongs that have been perpetrated against them. Oftentimes, discrimination is not as blatant or obvious as you might think, but to take a hypothetical, if your supervisor, and that tends to be one of the most important facts of a case, is that the supervisor, him or herself, is engaging in the discriminatory conduct. Examples of overt discrimination would include using racial slurs, treating that person differently, talking to that person, in ways that are frankly less than human, talking to and saying hateful things to them, and then treating them differently such that the terms and conditions of their employment are different and worse from similarly situated employees. And so if you have, let's say, two fast food workers, one of whom is African American, the other of whom is Caucasian, and the Caucasian is constantly getting better preferences for shifts, is spoken to in a more polite and respectful manner, while the person of color, who's also, let's say, in the same exact position, doesn't get those same privileges, then it might give rise to a race discrimination claim.
Okay.
The employer has to show, it's the plaintiff's burden to prove that discrimination occurred. So one simply can't say, I believe it's discrimination, and so show me why I'm wrong. The plaintiff has to prove by preponderance of the evidence that this was in fact unlawful discrimination. And the employer's defense is going to be that it wasn't discrimination, but instead the employer had a legitimate non-discriminatory reason for that conduct. And it's a high burden to show what's in somebody's, absent some actual recording or other strong, compelling witness testimony showing that someone was engaging in overtly racist acts, showing what's in someone's hearts and minds without any recording or direct evidence of it can be very challenging and difficult. So what we tend to see more often than not is a claim based on disparate treatment. So sort of like I mentioned, that the Caucasian worker is getting better treatment or better job options, even better pay, better opportunities for promotion, and the list goes on when compared to a person of color. Now, the same would be true for a male or a female. The same would be true for, perhaps a Caucasian is being mistreated, and on the basis of that Caucasian person's, race, they believe that a manager, oftentimes of a different race, is singling them out for mistreatment, and that would also give rise to a claim.
Are there common types of discrimination in regards to gender? I mean, would you say that there's common, or can you just talk a little bit about the most common ones and what you've seen?
Oftentimes, I feel like sex or gender claims are more overt. I think that the Me Too era has helped shine a light on a lot of very bad conduct that happens. Restaurants and the fast food industry, statistically, are some of the most offensive or worst places for females to work. I mean, some reports say 96% of all females who work in food service report having been harassed at least one time in the last year. So the harassment, the sex and gender cases that we see tend to be very egregious. Missouri law says that mere offensive utterances are not enough to maintain a claim. But of course, when there's a frequency of it, when the egregiousness of that, those utterances and that conduct shocks the conscience, clearly that's different from just mere utterances that are offensive. And so oftentimes it's groping, it's borderline sexual assault, it's the way people are spoken to, the way that they're treated, the shifts that they're assigned. Oftentimes, and it's not uncommon to still see that managers in many companies are going to all be male, and there are very few opportunities of advancement for females, despite the fact that females represent oftentimes an equal or disproportionately higher number of employees within the company. There are lots of reasons for that historically, but it's not uncommon to see that in various different work settings, women just aren't promoted as much, and that in itself is largely unlawful discrimination. But I think groping, I think touching, I think instances of sexual assault, treating women as objects in the workplace is very common, sadly. And I think particular industries are worse offenders, and fast food and the restaurant industries are probably two of the worst industries for female workers, sadly. It's a wide array of various different workplaces, and there are so many business owners, tens of thousands just in this state, and so it's very difficult. But I think restaurants or fast food might be common simply because that's where new jobs are created in this country. So low-wage industries are the fastest growing job creators in the country. And so with that, you see all types of abuses, including the fact that even though they might be paying the minimum wage, that wage is not enough. And I think people oftentimes, sadly, with low wages comes low respect and low dignity that you receive from managerial employees. And so I think those are maybe more popular because they're also the areas where jobs are more fastly growing. But we personally, we don't care who the employer is. We care what happened. The employer needs to be 6 or more employees to maintain a case in Missouri. The size of the employer also sets the damage caps. So in Missouri law, we now have damage caps, and the size of the employer, and this is also true under Title VII, will determine the types of damages that are, the amount of damages that are available to you. But fast food, I think, is common.
Okay. I'm just really glad you mentioned that, just because I think I have misconceptions, so I'm glad you cleared them up. Okay, what about, give me some examples of race discrimination in the workplace?
I think oftentimes it would be as overt as racial slurs being, used, but it's also situations that, you mentioned the term toughing it out. I think many people in this country with an economy that's so shaky feel that they need to just shut up and go about their business. They don't want to make waves. And that's a double-edged sword for everybody. Because if your coworkers aren't reporting that they're observing you being harassed, well, that potentially hurts you too, because people are more likely to find credibility in other people saying that this is going on as well. So people not sticking up means that the next person who has to go through the same thing, might not be believed. And so speaking out in the workplace, it's important because it's a protected activity. If they retaliate against you or others for your having engaged in a protected complaint, that's against the law. And I think people aren't aware of that, and they're nervous and they're afraid, and they should be, because it's hard to find a good job here. But in the same vein, what we look at is employers need to be on notice that it is a risky and costly proposition to treat people in ways that violate the law. And so workers need to be aware of the protections that exist for them so they feel more comfortable speaking up and speaking out about those bad behaviors. And look, we don't want to see employers treating employees poorly in ways that violate the law. And so I'd love to be put out of business because more and more workers are standing up for themselves and each other in ways that protect them under the law. But sadly, we're not there. And the Me Too movement has been a very keen and clear example of not only how prevalent the problem still is of sexual harassment in the workplace, but the importance of speaking up and speaking out about it.
Great. Okay, so you talked about retaliation. I'm going to make you repeat some of this because I think it's a good thing to talk about. So retaliation, it happens after a claim or lawsuit has been filed. Is that right?
It does. So you would, let's say, for instance, and there are several examples, but one would be if you speak up, you feel like you're being treated differently because of your sex or race or membership in a protected class or category in the workplace, and you tell your direct supervisor, this needs to stop, and then that direct supervisor treats you worse. That's retaliation. Oftentimes, retaliation is you speak out against unlawful conduct, and then you're terminated in a pretty short time thereafter. And so the question is, were you terminated in retaliation for that, or was there a legitimate business reason for them to have terminated you? So there are all types of ways that you can speak out against unlawful conduct and be retaliated against.
So a claim does not have to be filed for retaliation to be part of the lawsuit.
Correct. You don't have to file a charge of discrimination before you have a retaliation claim. But if you do file a charge of discrimination for employment discrimination and or harassment, and then you are retaliated against, then you can file a retaliation claim. So it could be either scenario. But reporting to a supervisor or an HR member, and this is also very important because employers will commonly look at this. What is their policy for reporting sex discrimination and harassment or any type of discrimination or harassment? And so employees can't simply, and this is common where we'll get a call and they have never reported the discrimination or harassment in the workplace. They might have talked about it to a coworker, but if that person has no supervisory authority, it's often very difficult because sometimes the employer does the right thing. Sometimes if the employer has knowledge of the problems that are happening, they want to fix them. They don't want to be exposed to liability for lawsuits. And so that is one of the key things for workers to know about their protected rights, is that if they feel like they're being discriminated against or harassed or retaliated against in any way, it is important for them to speak up about it so that it's documented and the employer has an opportunity to fix the problem. That's not a necessary ingredient to maintain a claim, but it helps to be proactive, because going through litigation is rarely, if ever, going to be as fruitful as just having gainful employment. And if you can keep your job, if you love your job and you want to stay there, it behooves you to complain about these issues. Obviously, the best case scenario is you live or work in a job that's free of discrimination. That's what the law requires. And that kind of reminds me of another important issue, and that's co-employee liability. So there is no co-employee liability under the Missouri Human Rights Act. And so if you're a coworker who, let's say you're both fry cooks, and your co-employee is kind of treating you wrong, or you're a cashier and your coworker cashier is maybe using racial slurs against you, that's oftentimes not enough if management or supervisors aren't aware of that discriminatory conduct. And so that typically triggers an obligation for you to then report it so that they have an opportunity to fix it or make it stop. Their liability comes from a failure to investigate and a failure to do anything to remedy the problem once it's known.
This is such great information. I would imagine that many of the people that contact you are scared. It's their livelihood and probably their family's livelihood, and encouraging them to report illegal behavior to their manager would seem incredibly daunting. And so, I mean, there's not really a question here. It's just that I feel like it's pretty brave to be able to speak up against it and to be able to bring it to the attention of your employee or your employer.
I agree. It is brave. And I have raised this comment at various different groups that, focus on the idea of trying to eliminate race discrimination, sex discrimination. And I always encourage groups that I'm in front of to, if you're a Caucasian worker and you see discrimination, or if you're a male worker and you see discrimination of a female, you should report it too, because that helps that person have some credibility in the eyes of the employer. And I feel like that's something that we miss the mark on oftentimes is, yes, a person who speaks out about the misconduct that's happening to them, they're incredibly brave because of what they're risking. And they should always report it. But the same is true of your coworkers. I feel like we need to encourage people and remind them of their moral obligation to adhere to the law and keep the workplace free from discrimination, and report it if you see it. Even if it didn't happen to you directly, your report goes a long way, sometimes maybe even farther than others. And so that's another key ingredient that I always encourage people, if I'm talking about employment discrimination, is if you see it happening to someone else, report it. And it could be as simple as maybe an off-color joke. It could be something as severe as a completely inappropriate racist joke or sexist joke, whatever. But if you see it, report it, no matter who you are.